What you are about to hear is not speculation, it is not hopium, and it is absolutely not what the mainstream wants you focusing on right now, because there is a growing whisper behind closed doors that a major XRP move is being quietly positioned, and one very well-connected voice claims he is 99.9999% sure it happens this year. And if that number sounds insane to you, good, because that shock you feel is exactly what Wall Street felt the first time they realized what was actually being built around Ripple and its native asset. Ask yourself this: why does the noise always spike right before silence? Why does fear always get injected before structure? And why are the same institutions that publicly dismiss XRP privately building infrastructure that only makes sense if XRP survives and dominates? This is where things get uncomfortable, because when you start lining up the dots between the SEC suddenly softening its tone, the IMF openly talking about tokenized liquidity corridors, and asset giants like BlackRock quietly expanding digital settlement exposure, you realize something is happening off camera, off Twitter, off the charts most people stare at every day. And here is the part nobody wants to say out loud. Insiders do not need to be right 100% of the time. They only need to be positioned before the narrative flips. And when someone with deep institutional proximity says they are almost completely certain a major XRP move happens within this cycle, that is not a casual statement. That is a warning disguised as confidence. Let me ask you an extreme question that should rattle you. What if the reason XRP has been suppressed, delayed, mocked, and declared dead over and over again is not because it failed, but because it succeeded too early and too quietly? This is why you need to be paying attention right now. And if you value getting this kind of analysis before it explodes into headlines, make sure you subscribe and stay locked in, because what we are about to unpack is not designed for casual viewers. It is designed for the ones who want to understand why certain people are so sure while the crowd is still laughing. We are going to break down the signals, the authority behind them, and the catalyst that could make even the most conservative price expectations look laughably small in hindsight. And yes, we are going to address the elephant in the room about those triple-digit XRP projections that everyone loves to scream are impossible. Because once you see the framework being assembled, the question is no longer could it happen. It becomes what happens if you were not ready when it did. Now we step into the part of this conversation where things stop sounding emotional and start sounding dangerous to the status quo. Because data does not care about your bias, and authority does not ask for permission, and this is exactly where XRP quietly becomes a problem for the existing financial power structure. Look at the timeline instead of the price, because price is what they use to distract you, while infrastructure is what actually determines winners. Over the last few years, Ripple has not been chasing retail hype cycles. It has been embedding itself into payment rails, liquidity solutions, and cross-border settlement frameworks that only make sense at scale. And scale is not built for retail traders. It is built for institutions, governments, and supranational organizations. When executives openly discuss on-demand liquidity corridors being tested in regions that move trillions annually, that is not a startup experiment, that is pre-deployment behavior. Now, layer on the regulatory chessboard, because this is where people get emotional instead of analytical. The long-running tension with the SEC was never just about XRP, it was about jurisdiction and control. And notice how the narrative has slowly shifted from existential threat to procedural cleanup. That transition matters more than any candle on a chart, because markets reprice certainty violently once clarity arrives. At the same time, global bodies like the IMF and BIS have been increasingly vocal about tokenization, instant settlement, and the inefficiencies of legacy correspondent banking. And here is the part that should make you pause. They are describing a problem that XRP was literally engineered to solve. You do not need a press release saying XRP is the answer when the blueprint matches the tool perfectly. Now add the institutional layer, because this is where credibility spikes. Asset managers, custodians, and liquidity providers aligned with firms like BlackRock do not move blindly. They move once legal risk drops below a threshold, and infrastructure maturity crosses another, and the quiet expansion into digital asset settlement exposure tells you those thresholds are being approached or already crossed. This is why someone close enough to see these shifts would say they are almost completely sure a major XRP move happens this year. Because once the data, the regulation, and the plumbing align, price does not crawl, it teleports. And here is the uncomfortable truth. By the time mainstream analysts feel safe talking about it, the asymmetry is already gone, which is why this phase feels boring, frustrating, and infuriating to holders, because boredom is the cost of front-running a repricing event. So ask yourself, if this was truly dead, why is so much effort being spent quietly preparing the environment it would need to function at global scale? That is not how dead assets are treated. That is how future infrastructure is handled before the lights turn on. Respected listeners, this is where the conversation usually gets attacked, mocked, and drowned in noise. Because the moment you start talking about catalysts instead of cope narratives, the fear machine activates at full power. Every cycle has one asset that must be discredited until the very last moment, and XRP has worn that target for years. Why? Because the catalyst here is not a meme, not a retail frenzy, and not a social media pump. It is a structural trigger that reorders liquidity itself. The real catalyst is not a single announcement, it is convergence, regulatory clarity reaching a tipping point, institutional plumbing already laid, and global settlement inefficiencies becoming politically unacceptable. When people scream, "What about delistings? What about suppression? What about banks building their own coins?" they are missing the bigger picture. Because institutions do not care about tribal crypto narratives, they care about efficiency, cost reduction, and control. This is where the FUD collapses under its own weight. The idea that banks will never use a neutral bridge asset ignores the reality that fragmented CBDCs increase friction, not reduce it, and that is exactly why neutral liquidity layers exist. This is why when you hear officials associated with bodies like the IMF discuss interoperability and cross-border settlement pain points, they are not fantasizing, they are admitting the current system is cracking under scale. The second FUD vector is regulation fear, and this one is already aging badly. The moment enforcement turns into rulemaking, uncertainty dies, and assets tied to real utility get repriced first. Watch how the tone from the SEC has shifted from existential to procedural, because markets are forward-looking and they smell when a war is ending before the press writes the headline. Then comes the conspiracy everyone laughs at until it is too late, institutional accumulation during maximum boredom. Big money does not chase green candles, it positions during ridicule, and the reason XRP discourse feels stale is because attention is being siphoned elsewhere while infrastructure quietly hardens. This is why the catalyst moment will feel sudden and violent, because nothing visible changes, yet everything underneath is already aligned. And here is the final psychological trick. People will say if this was real, the price would already reflect it, ignoring the fact that repricing events do not leak linearly, they gap. When the trigger hits, the same voices screaming scam will pivot to, "How did we miss this?" And that pivot always happens after the easy entries are gone. Respected listeners, this is the point where people get emotionally reactive because price forces accountability, and that is exactly why most never make it to this stage of understanding. Let us be brutally honest. A triple-digit XRP is not a fantasy number pulled from vibes. It is a function of math colliding with utility at scale, and that is why it scares people who are still thinking in retail market cap memes instead of settlement layer mechanics. If XRP is positioned even partially as a neutral bridge asset across high-volume corridors, the liquidity requirements are not optional. They are structural, because you cannot move trillions through an asset priced like a penny stock without catastrophic slippage. This is where the $100 plus conversation comes from, not overnight, not magically, but as a consequence of constrained supply meeting non-negotiable demand. When critics say that would make XRP bigger than everything else combined, they expose that they do not understand velocity, locked liquidity, escrow mechanics, or how settlement assets are valued differently than speculative tokens. Institutions aligned with players like BlackRock do not enter markets that cannot scale, and they certainly do not build exposure frameworks for assets that are meant to stay small. Now, here is the final warning part, because this is where complacency destroys people. If you are waiting for perfect clarity, perfect headlines, and universal agreement, you will only ever buy confirmation, never asymmetry. The people who get blindsided are not the ones who ignored XRP entirely. They are the ones who watched it for years and still froze when the move finally started. A major XRP repricing will not feel fair. It will feel abrupt, controversial, and deeply uncomfortable because it will invalidate years of public ridicule in a matter of weeks. And when that happens, the narrative will not be about whether XRP can reach extreme valuations. It will be about why it was obvious in hindsight. This is not a promise, it is a positioning alert, because markets do not announce regime changes politely, they enforce them violently.